In the cold hush of medieval nights, beneath the crooked eaves of rotting wood and moss, a figure waits. Not a ghost, but something far more desperate. The assassin. Not the silent, graceful specter of modern myth, but a man half-starved, a blade barely sharpened, a plan stitched from fear and borrowed time. There were no guilds, no codes, no honor, only coin and betrayal. It begins in secret corners, in taverns that smell of old blood and spilled ale. A wealthy patron, fearful of rivals. A desperate man, hungry, hunted, willing to kill for bread. There are no written contracts, only nods and lies. And once the job is done, the blade often turns again, this time toward the hand that paid it. No enchanted blades, no steel forged by wizards in distant lands. Just kitchen knives, sharpened twice maybe. A pot of bitter herbs that might, just might, stop a heart if the victim is slow. The tools of the medieval assassin were as crude as the hands that held them. And often those same hands would shake. Not from fear but cold and hunger. Disguise was not a robe of magic, but rags. Wool turned inside out. Boots borrowed from the dead. To vanish meant hiding in plain sight, to become no one, a face forgotten as soon as seen. Their greatest weapon was not their dagger, but their silence. Most assassins did not live to see old age. They were used, then erased. Some were killed by their targets, others by their clients. Many simply vanished, into ditches, rivers, or shallow graves. Their names lost. Their stories swallowed by the mud. Before Alexander, before empires and phalanxes, there was Olympias, daughter of Epirus, wife to a king, mother to a legend. But she was more than mother. She was oracle, priestess, the serpent queen. In her chambers, snakes whispered of destiny. And she listened. They say she slept with snakes. That dreams came to her not in words, but in omens. When she bore Alexander, the court whispered that he was not sired by a man, but by thunder, a god in human flesh, born to rule, cradled in fire. Power is never gentle. In Macedon it was a knife's edge, and Olympias walked it barefoot. Rivals conspired, lovers betrayed, even her own husband wavered. But she held her ground with fire in her gaze and prophecy on her tongue. Those who crossed her vanished. She told him he was born to rule, not as a king but as a god. That thunder ran in his blood, that the world would kneel because the stars had named him. And he believed her. Even after Alexander fell to dust, Olympias did not rest. She fought for his son, her grandson, against wolves who had once called her mother. She held cities, commanded armies, burned the names of traitors from stone, until finally they came for her. Long before swords clashed beneath stone ramparts, before cities fell to flames and catapult cries, there was an island where peace sang louder than war. Crete, cradled by sapphire tides, kissed by winds scented with thyme and sea salt. It was not a place of kings and conquest, but of artists and dancers, of weavers of color, of labyrinths built not to trap monsters, but to mirror the cosmos. They did not raise towers to threaten the skies, but palaces that breathed with earth and myth. This is where the story of Knossos begins. The palace of Knossos was not a fortress. It was a poem. For stories of color and corridor, 1,000 rooms woven like honeycomb, where light filtered through open skylights, and echo traveled like prayer. The columns leaned inward, defying expectation, as if the architecture itself were meant to humble the gods. Here, no throne dominated the chamber. No battlefield marred its walls. Instead, dolphins danced, lilies bloomed, women spun in long dresses beside sacred bulls. It was a palace that listened, not one that shouted. The labyrinth was not a maze of walls, but of purpose. It twisted inward, layer by layer, like the chambers of the heart. Rooms led to silence. Passages turned into reflection. Staircases circled upward like wind within a shell. No single path, no straight line, only spiral, rhythm, sacred disorientation. The myth of the Minotaur may be born of this. A story told to explain why every visitor left changed. Paint did not simply adorn these walls, it sang. Saffron-robed priestesses smiled at snakes. Young men vaulted bulls in arcs of grace. Blue monkeys frolicked in olive trees. And dolphins leapt through seas of dream. These frescoes were not just images. They were offerings, prayers to the wildness of life, to rhythm, to the endless wheel of return. Not one battle scene, not one spear, only life in movement, only nature adored. In Knossos, the bull was not a beast to be slain, but a gatekeeper, protector, pulse in the stone. They leapt over its back not to kill, but to commune. The bull of heaven, the axis between worlds. Its image crowned every rooftop, marked every altar, stood guard in the silence where gods were summoned in dance. They called it Tauros, not to dominate but to remember. And beside the bull, the serpent, the snake slithered not as a symbol of fear, but of birth, of healing, of the coil of time itself. Women raised them in worship. Let them wind across their arms as stars coiled through the sky. To the Minoans, the snake did not crawl through dust. It tunneled through the womb of the world. The music here was soft, not the march of boots, but the whisper of reeds. Flutes shaped from bone, lyres strung with gut, drums that beat like a sleeping heart. They played for the sun, for the moon's curve, for the sea that kept the island breathing. They played to keep the rhythm of time from fraying. They wrote, but not for us. Their language remains veiled. Linear A, etched in clay, still whispering secrets we cannot decode. Their thoughts survive in loops and strokes, unread by modern eyes. Like dreams we almost remember but can never retell. But peace is a tide, and every tide recedes. One day the earth growled, the skies dimmed, and the sea pulled its breath back too far. Thera erupted, a fury of ash and smoke, a thunder heard by gods and men. And Knossos shuddered, walls cracked, frescoes flaked. The sun vanished behind years of shadow. The golden palace became a ghost. And when the dust settled, another people came. From the north, the Mycenaeans, heavier, sharper. Their gods wore helmets. Their songs told of conquest. They walked the labyrinths not in reverence, but in ownership. And Knossos, once a temple, became a throne. And so came the age of siege. Not of art, but of engines. Not of gods, but of leverage. The first siege engines were logs with teeth. Rams swung by calloused hands. Fire-hardened stakes. Walls shaken by rhythm and brute intent. It was no longer enough to build. Now one had to unbuild, to conquer, collapse. Cities learned to dream in stone. Walls became prayers for survival. Thick, tall, layered with fear. Gates narrowed so that invaders might choke. Corners bent so that arrows might bite. It was not just defense. It was psychology, the first war of the mind. A siege does not roar. Wait. It creeps through days, seeps into nights. It is not the scream of charge, but the rustle of hunger, the groan of disease, the drip of time from a cracked sky. Walls are not broken in an hour. They are whispered to collapse by silence, by thirst, by the slow, creeping fog of inevitability. The battering ram, a tree reborn with fury. Its head, often shaped like a beast. Its body, slick with water-soaked hide to guard it from fire. It struck not once, but 1,000 times. Each blow a thunderclap of intention. Each swing a prayer for fracture. The gate does not splinter in surrender. It yields in exhaustion, like a heart too long under pressure. They climbed toward the moon, those wooden ladders rising like bones. To ascend a wall was to step beyond reason. Each rung held the weight of breath. Family, a final thought. Above, a boiling pot, a blade, a spear waiting just beneath your ribs. But still they climbed, because to not climb was to surrender. The defenders were not idle. They made the walls speak. They turned heat into agony, boiling oil, even sand. Heated until it blistered the flesh beneath armor. Pain from above like wrath from Olympus. You did not need a sword to kill a man, just patience, and a pot. And then there was the fire that should not burn. Greek fire. Its recipe lost. Its terror eternal. It burned atop the sea, unquenchable. Sent from brass dragons' mouths. Sailors jumped into water, only to find it followed them, clung to them, sang them into flame. It was not fire. It was myth made real. The breath of gods. Some sieges did not break stone. They broke spirit. A trebuchet flung not rock, but rot. Corpses. Infected meat. Disease wrapped in rag and death. They landed not with noise, but silence. A new kind of fear. And the enemy inside soon turned on itself. A city of the living became a vault for the dead. The siege tower. Wooden colossus, rolling cathedral of war. Covered in hide, drenched in water. It crept forward like dread incarnate. Inside, archers, spearmen, axemen. A stairway to slaughter. When its bridge fell onto the enemy wall, it was not conquest, but invasion. A new floor added to the skyline of battle. And then the breach. The silence before it lasts days. The noise after lasts centuries. Walls crack. Fires bloom. Screams echo down alleys. But the siege never ends there. It settles into ash. Into memory. Into songs sung low by the children of the conquered. And history forgets the weight, but never the fire. When the fire sleeps, the silence returns. But it is not the same silence. It is heavier. It clings to walls that no longer stand. It echoes in rooms where music once lived. The siege ends not in victory, but in stillness. And in Gnosis, that stillness became permanent. The dancers were gone. The priests fell silent. The sea continued to breathe, but no one painted its dolphins anymore. They say one remained. A priestess, veiled in soot and grief, still lighting the sacred fire though none watched. She whispered the old chants to gods who had fled. The snakes stayed. They always stayed. But even she was forgotten, buried not by time but by disinterest. What cannot be remembered must be mythologized. The palace became a labyrinth, the high priest a monster. The dancers became sacrifices. And in Athens they told the tale of Theseus, of thread, of sword and maze and slayer. It was easier to imagine a beast than a people who built without war. Easier to believe in monsters than to admit we had forgotten their names. Gnosis did not fall in fire. It fell in silence. Its stones remained. But the music stopped. The brushes were laid down. The scripts went unwritten. No trumpets of conquest. No victorious kings. Only absence. Quiet erasure. A memory written in petals and wind. And so the island slept. The tide washed over its stories. The winds tangled their truths. The olive trees grew thick where altars once stood. Centuries passed. Crete remained, but the Minoans became shadow. Not gone, just too quiet for the world that followed. New men came. Mycenaean, foreign, steel in hand, god-kings in their hearts. They walked the broken labyrinth and claimed it. But they could not rebuild it. They could only inhabit the shell. The spirit had flown. What was sacred was already dreaming beneath layers of forgotten dust. What good is a song if no one knows the tune? Linear a script unbroken. Its meaning a sea we cannot cross. Perhaps it held poems, or rituals, or nothing more than ledgers of trade. But we do not know. We may never know. Some languages die not with fire, but with forgetting. The earth remembers, even when we do not. Centuries later, hands came again, not to conquer but to uncover. Archaeologists listened to the soil. They traced frescoes with reverence. They pieced together horns, bones, and fragments of story. And slowly Knossos stirred. The bull leapt again, not in blood but in art. The blue returned to the dolphin's sea. The women in flounced skirts smiled once more. The temple columns stood, painted red with care, and children asked, did they really live this way? Did they really leap over bulls? Did they really have no war? And no one could say. But the colors answered softly, perhaps they did. History does not shout, sleeps. It waits for those who listen in the hush between breaths, in the dream before waking. Knossos remains, not as it was but as we remember it. Not a palace but a question, not a ruin but a rhythm. And if you are very quiet, if your breath slows and the dark leans in, you may still hear it, the footsteps of dancers beneath the moon, the whisper of a priestess, the hush of a labyrinth that leads not into fear, but into stillness. There is always something left, not gold, not glory, but the imprint, a footprint in ash, a bowl buried in dust, a comb, a cup, a carved bone flute, not treasure but trace. And from the trace, we remember the hand that shaped it. Every city that falls gives birth to wanderers. The priests become shepherds. The dancers turn to dust. The scribes go silent. But someone always survives. They do not rebuild the palace. They build a story. And that story travels into the hills, across the sea, into children not yet born. The city dies, but its name becomes legend. The gods do not forget. At Delphi, long after Knossos had fallen silent, a voice still whispered from the earth. The oracle, veiled in smoke, spoke of cities no longer standing, gods no longer worshipped, and truths older than empires. Those who listened heard a name, a fragment of Minoan song still echoing under stone. Time is not a line, it is a spiral. The same questions return, the same rises, the same falls. Palace here, a war there, a drought, a flood, a king who forgot to listen. And so we spiral again to new cities, new gods, new sieges, but always the same quiet ending. From Crete to the river valleys, civilization blossomed again. In the land of Sumer, Uruk, Babylon, new walls rose. Not of stone but of clay, sun-baked, brittle but full of words. The Minoans danced with bulls. The Sumerians wrote their laws into tablets, and time carried them both toward forgetting. No age escapes its siege. The gates fall. The tower burns. The temple empties. We build to keep out chaos, but chaos remembers the way in. From Knossos to Nineveh, we learn to wall, to defend, to wait. And always the waiting ends in ash. Around 1200 BCE, everything fell. Mycenae, Agarit, Hattusa, Roy. Palaces burned. Scripts vanished. Trade shattered. The sea was no longer safe. The roads no longer roads. The sky darkened, and the world forgot how to write. It was not one fall. It was many. A domino collapse of memory. No one knows where they came from. The Sea Peoples, a name given by the desperate. They arrived like a tide, speaking unknown tongues, burning what they could not conquer. To Egypt they brought storms. To Hatti they brought silence. To memory they brought mystery. Were they invaders or refugees? History does not answer. It only whispers. Among the ruins of other cities sometimes, just sometimes, a bull reappears. Shape, horn, a dance caught in clay. The Minoan spirit, carried like pollen on the wind, resurfacing in distant hands. But by then no one knew the meaning. The bull was not sacred, just decoration, memory reduced to shape. And after every fire, there is silence. The silence is not empty. It is full of questions, full of ghosts, full of seeds. The flowers bloom where blood once dried. The birds return to sing where screams once lived. And slowly, without noise, the world begins again. Not in triumph, but in quiet, always in quiet. Long after the palace had crumbled, long after the fires had cooled, the idea remained. Not a building, not a throne, shape, the spiral, the maze, the labyrinth, pattern the mind cannot leave. There is no door, no center, only the feeling of being inside something vast, something sacred, something forgotten. The labyrinth is not a place. It is memory folded in on itself. Some say there was one who stayed. A woman of the old blood, keeper of names no one could read, a singer of chants to gods who no longer answered. She did not flee when the city fell. She did not hide when the ships arrived. She stood on the cliffs, watching the sea take back the world. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through winds, through time, through dreams. The last priestess, the last breath of Crete. The name faded first. Once spoken in trade, in praise, in prayer. Now it was only a whisper, echoing in valleys, slipping through cracks, caught in the corners of foreign tongues. The palace did not die, dissolved, not into nothing but into everything. The myth of Atlantis, the tale of Minos, the echo of a labyrinth. Truth melted into story. What survives collapse. Monster. The Minotaur, half man, half beast, born of royal pride and sacred sin. They say he lived in the labyrinth, devoured youth, haunted dreams. But perhaps he was memory, the rage of a conquered people, the shadow of a forgotten god, the echo of a sacred bull, reduced to myth. And Theseus, the slayer, he was the story that helped the world forget. But it was not the sword that ended the maze. It was the thread. Ariadne, daughter of Crete, gave the thread, not the blade. She taught him to return, to retrace, to remember. The hero left her behind, but the thread remained, winding through time, through ruins, through memory. Ariadne's thread is not a rope. It is lineage. It is longing. It is the way back to what we lost. While Crete faded into sea foam, another city burned. Roy, a name built from fire and poetry. But beneath the myth, beneath the rage of Achilles and the wiles of Odysseus, there were bricks, wombs, families, and when it fell, its fall was remembered in song, but its truth was buried in dust. We remember the horse, not the hunger, not the heat, not the women who wailed as the city collapsed around them. They say he was blind, the man who gave voice to gods and ghosts. Omer, the singer of Troy's sorrow. He did not build walls. He built memory. From the shattered stones of past cities he crafted songs. He turned famine to fate, ashes to heroism, grief to glory. But even his voice is borrowed. He sang the ruins others had lived. Before Olympus rose, there were men who were gods, kings of shining halls, queens who spoke with birds, priests who danced with thunder. The gods we know were once rulers of cities. Their deeds, their faults, their dreams, written into the stars. And we forgot their names but kept their stories. This is how men become immortal. Not through truth, but through tale. Time does not erase, buries. The earth swallows what we leave, folds it into layers, compresses memory into silence. And then, centuries later, we dig. We brush away the dust. We wonder, what was this cup? Whose hand made this blade? Why were they forgotten? But the answer is always the same, because time is not cruel. It is quiet, and in quiet things sleep. Beneath all our cities, beneath our streets, our buildings, our dreams, lie the bones of older ones. The temple of Knossos, the palace of Minos, the labyrinth. They never truly disappeared. They sank into us, into our art, into our symbols, into the shape of our myths. The temple beneath our dreams still stands, though none of us remember how to enter. Beneath the skin of the earth, beneath centuries of silence and dust, a dream long forgotten waits in stone. Not a palace, not a city, something older, stranger, a ring of pillars, carved and standing still, a circle not for living but for remembering. We leave Crete now, and sail eastward across the Aegean, past waves that once lapped against the painted halls of Knossos, toward a land of no kings, no markets, no armies, only hunters, only gatherers, and yet they gathered here not to hunt, but to build temples to gods they could not name. Place called Göbekli Tepe, and it begins with a whisper in the soil. Göbekli Tepe, the navel of the earth. 12,000 years ago they raised stone into the air. Before wheels, before metal, before writing, they cut limestone with flint. They hauled it with rope and will. They stood it up with reverence. They were not farmers. They had no pottery, but they carved lions, birds, snakes, memories of a wild world still all around them. This was not a place to live. It was a place to return to, a memory made solid, a map of the sky written in shadow and weight. They gathered in circles, no corners, no edges, only the curve of the sacred, the way water circles in a cup, the way stars wheel overhead. On these pillars they carved the world. Foxes with arched backs, vultures mid-flight, snakes curling like rivers of omen, not symbols of fear, but of knowing. Each beast had a meaning, each meaning had a ritual, each ritual brought them closer to something larger, the spirit that lived between the stones. This was not mythology, this was memory encoded in limestone. There were no pharaohs to command them, no overseers with whips, only hands calloused and strong, hands that hunted, hands that shaped, hands that prayed. They came from far-off valleys, from forests, from rivers, bringing offerings, obsidian, animal bones, red ochre. They brought stories, they brought silence, they brought themselves. This temple was not a home. It was a gathering of belonging, where humans became more than flesh, where they became the echo of myth. And the cost of building this wonder was forgetting. One day they buried it, not in collapse, not in haste, but with ritual, with care. They filled their own sanctuary with dirt and silence. They pressed centuries of memories into the ground. They entombed their gods beneath their feet. Why? No one knows. Perhaps to protect it, perhaps to forget, perhaps because even the sacred must sleep. And for 10,000 years, Göbekli Tepe slumbered, beneath wheat fields and quiet winds, until the earth was cut open again, and the memory returned. We do not know their names, no scripts, no tombs, no kings, only stones, and stones do not lie. The hands that built Göbekli Tepe left no trace of their stories, except for the weight of the pillars, and the silence they summoned. We speak of pyramids, of ziggurats, of domes, but here is something older, softer, made not to reach the heavens, but to hold it in a circle. They are gone now, and yet, still here, before the city, before the state, before walls were raised and laws written in stone. There was memory, and memory was sacred. They did not write, but they remembered, in bones, in fire, in dreams. Göbekli Tepe was not a city, it was a pause, a breath between the chaos of survival and the whisper of meaning. Temple before time. Once they came in pilgrimage, the old and the young, mothers with ash on their foreheads, hunters who had seen too much, elders who heard the voice of the wind. They came not for blessing, but to remember they were part of the world. They left behind footprints, scars in the earth, and dreams that slipped between cracks in the limestone. Even now, the dust remembers their coming. Above them, stars wheeled endlessly. They did not name them as we do, but they knew them, knew when the fox appeared at dusk, when the vulture circled in the morning light, when the serpent curled low in winter's breath. Göbekli Tepe is a map not just of stone, but of sky, a memory of a world where the divine was written in stars, in wind, in the shape of a horned beast. Time moved on, and the people who carved these dreams vanished into it. But stone remembers, so does the dust, so do we when we listen. The wind still whispers across the hill, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to remind us that before all of this, there were hands, and there was wonder, and both still rest beneath the soil. There was a last fire. We do not know who lit it, nor what words they spoke as the flames rose one final time between the stones, but there was a silence afterward, a stillness so complete, even the vultures did not cry. It settled, wind rose, and then the world forgot, and then, as if obeying an unseen will, they buried it, not with haste, but as one might bury the bones of an ancestor, layer upon layer, stone upon memory, earth upon wonder. Why, we do not know. 1,000 years passed, then another. Seasons turned like slow wheels, and still the hill slept. When the first stones emerged again, they did not speak in words, but in shapes. The fox, the crane, the scorpion. These stones were books, in a language forgotten, before language was born. And then, one stone spoke louder than the rest, a pillar tall and solemn, with arms carved along its sides, hands folded as if in prayer. It was not just stone, it was someone, presence, a guardian. As archaeologists dug, they found more circles, shoulder, inch deeper. It was not one temple, it was many, built and buried, again and again. There is one fox, a small one, carved near the bottom of a pillar. Its presence lingers. You can almost hear it breathing. Beneath the dust, the vulture, bird of death and sky, messenger, even in death, rising. Now the circle sleeps again, not in hiding, but in quiet memory. They wait, as they always have, for silence. You cannot learn Göbekli Tepe. You can only remember. Perhaps every hill hides a memory. Perhaps every stone remembers being held. Göbekli Tepe is not a beginning, it is a door. And the dream beneath us all will stir again. Before the plow there was the hand. Before the ox, there was the mother's palm pressing seeds into earth, like memories sown into soil. Here, at the edges of Göbekli Tepe, women crouched low, not as servants to labor, but as keepers of the sacred. The grain was not food, it was continuity, the small miracle of a seed, buried, forgotten, and born again. No one yet called this agriculture. They called it return. And the harvest was a form of prayer. The fire no longer danced wildly in caves. It came indoors, into the arms of walls, into the rhythm of daily heat. What was once feral was now contained. Not just flame, but life itself was being tamed. Goats no longer fled at the scent of man. Wheat no longer drifted wild in the wind. And slowly, so slowly we domesticated ourselves. Not by conquest, but by compromise. By staying. By remembering the way back to yesterday's fire. Beneath the homes of the living they placed the dead. Not in sorrow, but in reverence. Fathers beneath hearths, mothers beneath doorways. Each body a foundation of memory. To enter the house was to pass over one's ancestors. To warm oneself by the fire was to know the bones that still listened. They were not forgotten. They were woven in. In this way, the dead were never truly gone, they were structural. The stars no longer blinked in ignorance. They were counted. They were tracked. Here, in this place without writing, the sky became a page, and the constellations, stories etched in darkness. The moon was a calendar, the solstice a promise. They did not study the stars, they joined them. With eyes that had never seen pollution, with hearts tuned to the hum of earth's breath, they lived in rhythm, in cadence, in the deep time of eternity. Surplus, the quiet revolution. No banner declared its coming. No king raised a sword. But in the back of a shelter, behind a woven door, someone placed a jar, and filled it, and sealed it, and kept it, not for today, but for a day yet to arrive. With this act, the future was born. The idea that there could be more than enough, and that enough was no longer the measure of life. And so it began, not with a sword but with a wall, not with conquest but with storage. The one who held the grain held the fate of many. The keepers of food became keepers of power. A bigger room, thicker wall, a door that others could not open. And slowly, hierarchy slid into being like a shadow at dusk. So gradual no one noticed until it was everywhere. The first king wore no gold. No metal had yet been melted. No scepter shaped from fire. But he stood higher than the others. And he spoke for the ancestors. His crown was ritual. His power borrowed from the spirits. He did not command. He interpreted. And the people, in awe of mystery, obeyed not the man, but the unseen forces behind him. And so authority was born, not from law but from belief. The home, once a place of rest, became a place of reverence. The line blurred between house and altar, between the family hearth and the world beyond. Here offerings were placed, not just to nourish but to communicate, beg, thank, to remember. Every meal a ritual, every birth a reenactment of the earth's renewal. And the temple was not above the village. It was within it. They were not gods yet, not as we know them. They were forms, echoes of fertility, of night, of birth and stone and flame. Small figurines, carried in pockets, placed in graves, offered to soil. They were mothers, they were bulls, they were stars with names no longer known. And through these shapes, people reached toward the incomprehensible. The divine was not above. It was everywhere. The sky was once a book with no pages, only awe. No city lights to drown its fire, no noise to dull its silence. The stars spun in their ancient dance, and humans looked up, not with questions but with remembrance. They had been here before, in dreams, in visions, in the language of birds and breath. And though no one yet wrote their names, they were known as siblings, signs, stories. Before the sun crowned the desert with fire, before the salt winds rushed down from the Andes, there were those who stood in silence, listening to the sky's breath. Carol was not a city of armies. No walls, no weapons, only courtyards of light, plazas that sang to the horizon, and staircases that remembered the seasons. Here time was marked not with bells, but with shadow, with the slow tilt of the sun's return. And the priests did not speak. They listened, to wind, to stone, to the memory of stars. In a world slowly waking to conquest, Carol dreamed another way. City without swords, people who built not for empire but for balance. Music floated on reed flutes. Trade crossed long rivers like quiet song. And though their gods demanded offerings, they asked not for blood. Carol's greatness was not measured in conquest, but in calm, in structures built to echo wind, in plazas made for stargazing. This was not a pause in history. It was a choice, a civilization that whispered, peace is also power. Before the scroll, before the tablet, the loom was the library. Every thread, a syllable. Every color, a sentence. They wove rivers. They wove flame. They wove gods too vast for language. And when they wrapped the newborn in cloth, They were wrapping them in story. History passed not by pen but by pattern. And the weaver was a priest in disguise. Some prayers were never spoken. They were bundled in straw, tied with silence, placed in hollow places where no footsteps would return. The offerings of Carol were quiet, like breath against a cold morning. Burned cotton, woven shells, tiny figures carved not to impress, but to remember. The gods, it seemed, wanted nothing loud. Only the hush of devotion and the patience of those who believed in balance more than glory. They built a temple that did not sing, but listened. Flutes placed in the stone, not to be played by hand, but by the breath of the world. When the wind came, the city sang, not with voices but with resonance, a song only the earth could summon. And the people did not cheer. They sat, quiet as stone, letting the sound pass through them like a memory of something they had always known. The river did not belong to them. They belonged to it. It fed their fields. It carried their trade. And in its songs the old ones heard prophecy. Children were taught to read its moods as others read stars. A ripple meant danger. Foam curl meant harvest. The river was a mother, a mirror, a god with no face. And they bowed not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The kind that lives only where life is fragile and the source is sacred. There were no battalions here, no armies, no painted shields, but there was order, a kind born not from fear, but from shared necessity. Their strength was not in war, but in architecture, in alignment, in silence, each plaza a conversation, each meeting a ritual. Their peace was not passive, it was structured, enforced not with blade, but with trust. And in that, Carol stood longer than many who built with blood. Spirals carved into clay, spirals laid in stone, spirals traced in wind. To move through Carol was to walk a labyrinth of meaning, inward, then outward again, as if every journey was both exile and return. The spiral was not just design, it was philosophy, a truth deeper than walls, that what begins will end, and what ends will one day begin again. And then they left, not all at once, not in fire, but in slow forgetting. The plazas emptied, the flutes fell silent, the wind, once welcomed, now wandered alone. No one knows why, but the stone remains, as if waiting, as if the city itself remembers, a place where silence is not absence, but remembrance. Carol is not lost, it is sleeping. Before the word there was breath, before history there was listening. Carol still breathes, in dust, in spiral, in windsong. And when we dream of a world without war, without hunger, without kings, crowned in steel, we are dreaming not forward but backward, to a people who sang with the sky, who listened to the earth, and who, for a moment, showed us that civilization could be born not in conquest, but in quiet die in the lowlands of what would one day be called Mesopotamia, land between the rivers. Human hands began to mold mud into permanence. The clay beneath their feet, once a nuisance in flood, became memory's cradle. They shaped it into bricks, bowls, and tablets that could whisper what the wind had once blown away. Here, in this soft bed of earth and water, the first villages began to dream of walls, and time itself began to pool into ledgers and lines. This was not yet empire, but the soil from which it would rise. In these fields, the harvest was no longer a gift from the gods alone. It was measured, rationed, recorded in rows of strange wedge-shaped marks. To control water was to control life. And so the first kings were not crowned by bloodshed, but by canal. They were the water masters, the flood callers, the men who made the barley rise in lines and the sheep birth twins in spring. Their power was sacred, not because they held swords, but because they held the schedule of the flood. Uruk was a whisper that turned into a roar. A city before cities had names. Uruk stood where mud and willpower conspired to defy the wilderness. Here rose the first great ziggurat, a man-made mountain that touched the belly of the sky. Here, scribes invented time's ledger, writing not for poetry, but for barley rations, taxes, and temple records. Here myth and accounting were siblings. And as Uruk grew, so did the distance between man and wild. Stone was carved to replace memory, and kings began to dream of forever. To write is to remember, but also to forget. When the scribe pressed his reed into clay, he froze a moment in time, but freed the mind to let go of all else. Memory was no longer held in song, but stored in mud. And so, slowly, the elder who sang became the clerk who wrote. The myth became a ledger. The prayer became a receipt. And in this, something was gained, and something irretrievably lost. The temples rose like stairs for the soul, each level a breath closer to heaven. They were homes not for people, but for gods too powerful to walk the earth. Inside, the priests moved like shadows, tending eternal fires, feeding idols with incense and bloodless offerings, milk, dates, and crushed myrrh. The temple was city heart and sky ladder, tax office and oracle. In these brick sanctuaries, kings learned to speak through gods and gods learned to rule through kings. And then a voice emerged, not just of kings or gods, but a woman of ink and fire. Inhejuana, daughter of empire, high priestess of the moon god Nana. She wrote not for ledgers, but for longing. Her hymns flowed like river prayers, her words binding heaven and earth in lines of divine devotion. She was the first name known, etched into time not as subject, but as author. In her verses, gods wept, stars trembled, and love rose like incense over Uar. But even in the land of law and grain, fear had its place. The cities rose their walls, not to keep nature out, but to keep each other away. Uruk watched Uar, Lagash-idama. One village's harvest became another's hunger, and so bricks became shields. And the earth, once tilled for peace, was trampled for pride. The first kings had worn reed crowns. Now they wore bronze. They did not fight for land alone, but for heaven. Every city had its god. And every war was fought in the name of divine jealousy. When Lagash attacked Umma, it was Ningirsu against Shera. Steel was still unborn, but bronze sang sharp songs. And with each war, another temple rose higher. Another god grew louder. Another child did not return. And then came a man who would not die. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, builder of walls, friend of wild men, lover of gods, killer of beasts. He ruled like a storm. But when his friend died, he wept like a child. He journeyed to the ends of the world, seeking the secret of life, and found this, that to be human is to grieve, that to build walls is not to escape death, but to sing against it. His tale became the first epic, and in it we still wander. Now Uar is silence. The moon goddess's temple is dust. The scribes are bone. The walls are ash. But the dust remembers. In every cracked tablet, in every name forgotten then found again, in every buried jar of grain, the past breathes. Mesopotamia was not the beginning, nor the end. It was a heartbeat, echoing through time's dark corridors. And if you listen, you'll hear it still. There is a river that runs not south to north, but sky to earth. The source is mystery. Its rhythm is breath. Its name is life. The Nile did not simply water a land. It summoned a civilization. Where it flooded, seeds bloomed. Where it withdrew, stone rose. It carved green veins into a desert's golden skin. And there, humanity carved memory into eternity. This was not just a river. It was a calendar, a god, a promise made fresh each year when the waters kissed the soil. Before the pharaohs wore gold, they wore dust. They built not with glory, but with wet hands and bent backs. Houses of sun-dried brick, towns of silence and reed, settlements that pulsed with life long before the first cartouche was chiseled. And yet in every village, in every grain granary, The seeds of gods were already growing. The divine would one day wear crowns, but first it learned to live among farmers and herdsmen beside the breathing flood. There came a moment when two lands kissed and became one. Upper Egypt, the reed and mountain. Lower Egypt, the delta and sea. Their spirits clashed in war and married in power. Narmer, the first to wear both crowns, the first to be more than man. His palette did not record a face. It etched an idea that the land could be whole, that beneath one crown, rivers and winds could flow together. So began the world's first long kingdom, not built on conquest alone, but on symbol. Before pyramids pierced the clouds, there was a dream in limestone. Djoser ruled not as a god, but as a bridge to one. His architect Imhotep was no mere builder. He was a priest, a healer, a whisperer between worlds. Together they imagined a staircase for the soul, a pyramid not of sand, but of permanence. 6 stone steps, one ascent toward forever. And thus, in silence, architecture became prayer. Stone does not sleep. It remembers every hand that touched it. For each pyramid, there were tens of thousands, not slaves, but citizens summoned by the flood. When the river rested, the people built, not for a wage, not for praise, but for the soul of their king. They pulled stone not with chains, but with songs, and each block bore not only weight, but hope. In death there was no rest, only a journey. The soul passed through fields of fire, lakes of stars, and mirrors of memory. At last it stood before the balance. On one side, a heart heavy with life. On the other, the feather of Ma'at, truth, order, harmony. If the heart was heavier, it was devoured. If it was light, the soul flew on into the fields of reeds where death was undone. Then came a king who broke the sky. Akhenaten, the heretic, the sun's servant. He banished the gods of shadow and called the Aten, the solar disk, the only god. He tore down temples, built a new city, wrote hymns not to Osiris, but to light itself. The priests raged, the court whispered, but for a moment, Egypt glowed with a strange clarity. Then the light faded, his city crumbled, and the old gods returned, smiling. Death was not an ending, but a chamber. Every tomb was a universe, every wall a map of the soul's voyage. There were spells, charms, boat models, and jars for the organs of dreaming. And gold, not for wealth but for eternity. Pharaohs did not die. They became stars. Each tomb a launch into the forever night. But even eternity is not immune to hunger. Tomb robbers came by torchlight, not for history but for survival. They pried open coffins, melted amulets, ripped linen from kings. They left behind silence, broken jars, scattered bones, and yet still the dead whisper. Still they hold the horizon in their painted eyes. The Egyptians had a word, Ankh, life. To speak a name was to resurrect it. To remember was to return. So we whisper Djoser, Imhotep, Narmer, Enheduanna, Gilgamesh, and through us they live again, not as rulers, not as gods, but as sparks in the great quiet of time, floating on the river that never ends. In the delta, where reeds whisper and papyrus grows thick in the flooded light of the Nile's return, Egypt dreamed still, but the dream had grown heavy, heavy with years, with centuries of crown and temple, with the weight of stone statues whose eyes had watched 1,000 summers turn to dust. The pharaohs still walked the avenues of power, but their feet no longer touched the ground. The priests, draped in linen white as dawn, chanted rites that once called stars to order, but now echoed into stillness, as if the gods themselves had turned away, or fallen asleep in their golden barks. In Memphis, in Thebes, hieroglyphs still carved the breath of Ra into walls, but fewer hands read them. The scribes were growing old, and their sons chose war. And so Egypt drifted, not broken, not ruined, but dreaming, forgetting the dream was theirs to tend. and then came those with no name, not from the desert nor the highlands, but from the open waters, from the blue vastness beyond sight. The sea peoples, the scribes called them, for no other name would fit. They did not send envoys. They sent fire. They did not trade. They took. They came in waves like the tide, unreadable, unknowable, carrying with them iron blades and burned languages. Cities fell. Ugarit, Ashkelon, Byblos, even mighty Hattusa, gone in the silence of collapsing roofs and vanished scripts. They did not build, they ended. Ramesses stood at the edge of memory. Not the great Ramesses II, who carved his image into mountain stone, but his sons, his grandsons, names lost in the echo of throne rooms emptied by time. They fought the seaborne and held the Nile for a time, but the fields no longer yielded grain in surplus. The gold from Nubia slowed. The temples, once bright with paint and incense, gathered dust on forgotten altars, and the voice of Ma'at, of balance, grew fainter in their ears. The horizon darkened, not with the night, but with forgetting. Across the world of bronze, everything began to end, not in a single day, but in the slow rhythm of decay. Trade routes dried like old rivers. Markets fell silent. The copper mines of Cyprus lay abandoned. The scribes of Mycenae wrote no more. Cities fell not always by fire. Sometimes they were simply walked away from. The kings were gone. Temples closed. The world had grown too large, too complex. And now it fell inward, folding like parchment at the seams. Imagine a merchant's path, once safe from Cyprus to Troy, now haunted by bandits, by hunger, by the ghosts of promises made in silver and weighed in grain. Villages turn into fortresses. Fields lie fallow. The oxen are eaten. In Anatolia, in the Levant, children are born who have never seen peace. Their lullabies are the clash of bronze. Their toys broken spearheads. The world narrows. The golden masks are buried, and no one remembers the names they wore. Clay tablets, once inscribed by steady hands in orderly lines, now lie in shattered heaps. In Ugarit, letters to forgotten kings remain unopened. Plea for aid, a final message never answered. "We are surrounded," one tablet reads. "This is the end." And no one replied. And so the silence returned. A silence deeper than night. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of memory. The storytellers stopped. The scribes vanished. And the stars looked down on a world that no longer knew their names. It would be centuries before the clay was inscribed again. Before kings once more claimed gods as fathers. Before cities rose with walls wide as rivers. But for a time the fire had gone out. In the black hollow left by the fallen world, cities did not die all at once. They decayed in layers, mud brick giving way to grass, pillars crumbling inward like tired bones. Wind moved through broken lintels. Goats wandered where scribes once prayed. And in the silence, the memory of kings became rumors. The memory of gods became dust. But even in stillness, beneath the soil, life held its breath. It was the earth that remembered first. She took back what stone had claimed. She swallowed columns, broke roads, but held the seeds close. Barley slept under centuries of ash. Olive trees leaned into forgotten groves. And where the plow had once sung, roots pushed through the crust. The earth is never finished. It waits, it turns. And eventually she whispers, "Begin again." Bronze had fallen, melted, hoarded, stolen from temple and tomb. In its place came something colder, iron, harder to forge but stronger in the hand. It did not gleam like gold, but it endured. And with iron came the new smiths, working in shadows, listening not to gods, but to the hiss of heat, the strike of hammer, the singing of spark against steel. The world did not rise again in gold. It rose in gray fire. They did not know they lived after an age had ended. They only knew hunger. the closeness of sky to earth. But the children of collapse built small fires in the dark. They told stories even if the names had changed. They buried the old gods, but whispered to the same stars. They rebuilt not as the ancients had, but in circles, in huts, in timber. From the bones of the fallen empires, they gathered wood, not stone, and waited. Time does not end, it folds. And in folds of silence, music returned. A shepherd's reed pipe, a mother's lullaby sung over ashes, a drum beating in sync with a heartbeat. These were not royal hymns, but they stirred something deeper. The rhythm of rebuilding, the melody of memory. And from these humble songs, cities would one day rise again. From the north the dagger-bearers came, not with armies, but with movements like roots through stone. They wore furs, spoke sharp tongues, and carried iron not for ceremony, but for survival. They did not bow to pharaohs. They did not sing of Enlil or Ra. But they built fires at river crossings, set stones in circles, and left bones painted in red ochre beneath cairns. And the land long forgotten took them in. First came fences, then palisades, then walls. From fear, from memory, from the dream that safety could be built from stone. And so towns formed, rough, huddled, and stubborn. Not cities of marble, but cities of clay and grit. The world was smaller now, but within that smallness, there was room to grow again. Iron reshaped not only weapons, but minds. New blades meant new kings, new lands to conquer, new gods to invoke before battle. No longer did power come from divine blood. It came from the arm strong enough to hold a sword. And in that grim meritocracy, a new age dawned, with helmets, with war cries, with a thundering sound of hooves. The world had lost its scripts, but not the need to speak. And slowly, in Phoenicia, a spark flared again. Not pictographs, not cuneiform, but letters, small simple marks, easy to carve, to teach, to spread. The alphabet, the birth of a fire that would burn through centuries, binding future minds to past thoughts, carried on parchment and breath. The mighty had fallen, but the small had endured. Hill tribes, sea traders, horse-borne herders from the grasslands, they stepped into the empty halls of empire. They did not seek to restore what was lost. They forged new dreams from iron and sea foam, from firelight and silence. And so the future would not belong to the old gods, but to the forgotten. Along the coast where cedars touch the wind, a people carved their fate from salt and sail. The Phoenicians, they did not conquer by sword, but by current and compass, by memory of stars and the creak of ropes in dawn mist. Their ships stitched the edges of the Mediterranean, threading Cyprus to Sicily, Tyre to Tartessos, with cargoes of purple dye, cedar beams, and words in letters in scrolls. Scrolls that would one day name gods unborn. They sailed not just seas, but the tides of time, before marble columns, before hoplites and myths cast in bronze. There were olives and goats, humble, enduring in rocky soil and stubborn hills. The Greeks were not yet philosophers, not yet poets, they were shepherds. They were planters. They wove and ground and prayed to winds. But in their labor was rhythm, and in their quiet, a strange thought took root, that the world was not only sacred, but understandable, and in time, that thought would echo louder than thunder. Where once gates of stone opened to kings and scribes, now only the wind passes freely. Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, stood like a forgotten hymn, its scripts unread, its gods unsummoned, ashes cooled, wolves nested where scribes once knelt. But ruins are never fully dead, for within the silence of that shattered city lay seeds of future empires. Its stones whispering to Persia, its memory aching into Rome. From the steppe came a whisper, then a roar. Riders, quick like flame across dry grass. They bore no temples, no pyramids, but fire moved with them, in spirit, in language, in bloodline. The Indo-Europeans, scattered like pollen, they seeded tongues and gods across continents, Thor and Yaush, Zeus and Jupiter. all carried echoes of sky fathers once cried out to in cold valleys. They were not a people, but a song, rewritten with every hoofprint. In the mountains where the air thins, Urartu watched the valleys below. Stone fortresses clung to cliffs, cisterns carved from volcanic rock fed orchards. They worshipped sky, but their gods had the weight of basalt. Urartu did not seek the sea. It mastered silence, a silence that burned like fire in a hearth no one dares extinguish. They did not conquer with swords, they conquered with words. The Arameans, traders, diplomats, scribes, their script, born of Phoenician bones, spread farther than empires. Assyrians used it. Babylonians adapted it. Even distant Judah would carry it home, and so their language, wove through clay, papyrus, and memory, that a quiet empire that of ink. Old kingdoms rarely die. They simply slumber. Egypt rose again, not as it once had, but reborn under foreign crowns, Libyan kings, Nubian lords, priests with more power than pharaohs. And yet the Nile flowed the same, pyramids still caught the light, temples still echoed with chants older than the sun. Even wounded, Egypt remembered itself. When chaos cooled, men remembered order. In temples they carved codes and plazas, they raised hands in judgment. Laws were no longer divine thunder, but civic breath, from Assyria to Athens, from tablets to trials. The idea bloomed, that even kings must kneel before words. Even as iron ruled, bronze lingered like a ghost, and jewelry and mirrors and rites no one remembered the origins of. Bronze was more than a metal, it was memory made solid. And though the age had passed, its shadow stretched long, through myth, through ritual, through every dream of golden ages that never quite were. The world had rebuilt itself, but not as before. Now the gods were nearer. Now the people had voices. Now words could travel faster than spears. And in the hills of Attica, in the orchards of Judah, in the markets of Carthage, something stirred, not empire, not conquest, but thought. The threshold of the classical age awaited. With its questions, its paradoxes, its beauty spun from doubt, there was a war. Or perhaps there was only a song about a war. One that echoed louder than the clash of bronze. A song of Helen's face. A wooden horse. A city aflame beneath stars that cared nothing for kings. Whether it fell in dust or dream, its ruins became the bedrock of story. And from the ashes of that myth, the Greeks would carve their first mirror, not of who they were, but who they believed they had once been. No one knows his name. They call him Homer, but he may have been many, or none, just a voice, carried by mouths and memories, threading epics through generations like flame passed hand to hand. The Iliad, the Odyssey, not merely stories, but blueprints of a world where honor bled beside gods, where the sea was a character, and home was a horizon always out of reach. From Homer's silence bloomed an entire civilization's soul. Polis, not just a city, a living idea. Athens, Corinth, Sparta, born not of empire but of argument. No throne but an assembly, no god-king but many gods, and many voices, each polis a different vision, of order, of justice, of what it meant to be human. The stones rose, temples, agoras, theaters, but the true architecture was philosophical, open air, open minds, and a fierce, fragile freedom. First came kings, then councils, then Solon, not a ruler of armies, but of balance. He listened more than he spoke. He weighed the rich and the poor, not in gold but in justice. From his pen came law like melody, not rigid but flexible, not perfect but enduring. And Athens began to awaken, from rule to right. While Athens wrote laws, Sparta sharpened them. No scrolls, no speeches, only discipline, only duty. They lived without gold, without wine, without softness. Their children were soldiers by age 7. their elders silent, watching. They did not build cities, but themselves. Their answer to chaos was control, total and unyielding. In Delphi, the world breathed through a fissure. The oracle, a woman who spoke in riddles and gasps, became the voice of gods. Kings traveled across continents for a word, a whisper, a single syllable from Apollo's mouth, carried on vapor. But was it prophecy, or politics, faith, or fear? Oracles gave answers no one could understand. And so, in their ambiguity, men found their own truths. The city needed order, but the soul craved release. And so came Dionysus, god of wine, of frenzy, of transformation. And with him the theater, not merely entertainment, but catharsis. The stage became sacred ground, where masks wept, and truth slipped out through tragedy. In every chorus, people ask, what is just? What is fate? Who are we beneath these fragile skins? Not a revolution, a germination. From soil tilled by laws and lifted voices, Athens planted a strange tree. Democracy, not yet perfect, not yet for all, but it bloomed nonetheless, with votes cast by hand, with leaders chosen not by blood but by lot. Power for the first time was something to be earned or lost. They did not carry swords, they carried questions. Socrates, the gadfly of Athens. He stung the complacent, asking what is good, what is real, what is worth dying for. He spoke until the city silenced him, yet his voice multiplied. Plato wrote, Aristotle organized, and through them thought became tradition, not of dogma, but of doubt. While city-states debated, an empire watched. Persia, from the Zagros Mountains to the Nile, from the Indus to the Aegean, a single system, single breath. Urus, Darius, Xerxes, they ruled not with flame, but with roads, and couriers, a world sewn together by policy, not plunder. And yet the Greeks would not kneel. Thermopylae, a narrow pass, a moment frozen in bronze. 300 stood, not to win, but to show that loss can still be defiance. Behind their shields, a world held its breath. They were not heroes because they won. They were heroes because they chose to lose. With honor intact, against empire, Athens burned brighter. Its fleet, wooden walls of Themistoclean cunning, broke Persia at Salamis, and in victory it grew bold. Too bold. Democracy turned to dominance. The Delian League became empire. The line between liberty and tyranny blurred, even in the city that once questioned everything. And then it rose. The Parthenon, not just stone, but song made visible. Pericles stood beneath its pediment and spoke of citizenship, of duty, of a city greater than its walls. It was Athens' golden hour, and golden hours never last. Even as it glowed, Athens fractured. War loomed between siblings, between ideals. Sparta watched, envy brewed, and within Athens itself, ambition outpaced wisdom. The stage was set not for drama, but tragedy. The classical age had risen like a song, and like all songs, its final notes would echo in silence. The streets of Athens were not silent, but the silence had changed. No longer the hush of awe before philosophy, but the tense quiet of neighbors not meeting eyes. Sparta was watching. Corinth was calculating. The city-states had once fought side by side. Now they measured each other like rival stars, burning too close in the same narrow sky. The Peloponnesian War did not come in thunder. It crept in like mildew on scrolls, slow, certain, and ruinous. Athens radiant and proud, Sparta silent and unyielding. They tore each other apart, with words, with fleets, with plagues. Democracy dimmed. Virtue became currency. Philosophers drank poison while generals counted corpses. It was not empire that defeated Athens, but the weight of its own shadow. As cities burned and reason fell quiet, even the temples seemed less certain. The gods watched, but they did not intervene. Statues stood still and white, in altars crusted with forgotten incense. And the people, once so sure of Olympus, began to ask quieter questions. If wisdom could not stop war, what was it for? While Athens mourned and Sparta faded, a chill wind stirred from the north, Macedon. To the Greeks it was half barbarian, a place of rough kings and thicker dialects. But Philip was no fool. He studied the Greeks, then surpassed them. Spears grew longer, walls grew higher, and behind his eyes, there burned the plan of something larger than Polis, larger than Hellas, empire. The boy was impatient. The teacher was immortal, in thought if not in flesh. Alexander, Aristotle. One dreamed of conquest, the other of essence. Together they walked between scrolls and stars, speaking of virtue and empire, Achilles and justice, Asia and the soul. And in the boy's mind, the Iliad became prophecy. Philip united the fractured lands, by gold, by blade, by marriage and siege. But kings do not grow old peacefully. At a wedding, beneath bright banners and blinding wine, the knife found his ribs. Some say it was personal, others political. But the boy, barely 20, stood up and never sat down again. He could have ruled Macedon alone. But Alexander was born with a compass in his heart that pointed not to a throne, but to the edge of every map. He burned Thebes to warn the others. He crossed into Persia, not for revenge, but for legend. In his wake, myths were made real. The eagle was flying, and none could recall when they had last seen such wings. On the far side of the world, another king waited, Darius III. He ruled palaces of gold and gardens that bloomed by command. His word was law, but law does not stop lightning. Alexander struck fast. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela. Every time Darius fled, the myth of Persia fled with him. He took the Persian heart and burned it. Persepolis, jewel of the East. Its columns had held up centuries of empire. Its walls shimmered with reliefs of tribute and order. And Alexander, drunk, vengeful, or perhaps just tired, set it ablaze. The flames devoured more than marble. They devoured meaning. And the boy who once studied under Aristotle became something else entirely, eastward still. He chased the sun past deserts, through the folds of Afghanistan, into the green edge of India. Each battle became more like a dream, with elephants and gods, with monsoons and mountain ghosts. His men begged him to turn back. He wept that there were no more worlds to conquer. But the world always had more. It just didn't always want to be found. The streets of Athens were not silent, but the silence had changed. No longer the hush of awe before philosophy, but the tense quiet of neighbors not meeting eyes. Sparta was watching. Corinth was calculating. The city-states had once fought side by side. Now they measured each other like rival stars, burning too close in the same narrow sky. The Peloponnesian War did not come in thunder. It crept in like mildew on scrolls, slow, certain, and ruinous. Athens radiant and proud, Sparta silent and unyielding. They tore each other apart, with words, with fleets, with plagues. Democracy dimmed. Virtue became currency. Philosophers drank poison while generals counted corpses. It was not empire that defeated Athens, but the weight of its own shadow. As cities burned and reason fell quiet, even the temples seemed less certain. The gods watched, but they did not intervene. Statues stood still and white, in altars crusted with forgotten incense. And the people, once so sure of Olympus, began to ask quieter questions. If wisdom could not stop war, what was it for? While Athens mourned and Sparta faded, a chill wind stirred from the north, Macedon. To the Greeks, it was half barbarian, a place of rough kings and thicker dialects. But Philip was no fool. He studied the Greeks, then surpassed them. Beards grew longer, walls grew higher, and behind his eyes, there burned the plan of something larger than Polis, larger than Hellas, empire. The boy was impatient. The teacher was immortal, in thought if not in flesh. Alexander, Aristotle. One dreamed of conquest, the other of essence. Together they walked between scrolls and stars, speaking of virtue and empire, Achilles and justice, Asia and the soul. And in the boy's mind, the Iliad became prophecy. Philip united the fractured lands, by gold, by blade, by marriage and siege. But kings do not grow old peacefully. At a wedding, beneath bright banners and blinding wine, the knife found his ribs. Some say it was personal, others political. But the boy, barely 20, stood up and never sat down again. He could have ruled Macedon alone. But Alexander was born with a compass in his heart that pointed not to a throne, but to the edge of every map. He burned Thebes to warn the others. He crossed into Persia, not for revenge, but for legend. In his wake, myths were made real. The eagle was flying, and none could recall when they had last seen such wings. On the far side of the world, another king waited, Darius III. He ruled palaces of gold and gardens that bloomed by command. His word was law, but law does not stop lightning. Alexander struck fast. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela. Every time Darius fled, the myth of Persia fled with him. He took the Persian heart and burned it. Persepolis, jewel of the East. Its columns had held up centuries of empire. Its walls shimmered with reliefs of tribute and order. And Alexander, drunk, vengeful, or perhaps just tired, set it ablaze. The flames devoured more than marble. They devoured meaning. And the boy who once studied under Aristotle became something else entirely, eastward still. He chased the sun past deserts, through the folds of Afghanistan, into the green edge of India. Each battle became more like a dream, with elephants and gods, with monsoons and mountain ghosts. His men begged him to turn back. He wept that there were no more worlds to conquer. But the world always had more. It just didn't always want to be found. He was only 32, but the world had already aged around him. In Babylon, the lion of Macedon lay still, a fever blooming like fire beneath his skin. Some say poison, some say grief, some say the gods had seen enough, but none could stop it. Not his generals, not his scribes, not his physicians with honeyed wine and desperate prayers. The boy who had chased the edge of the earth was being chased now by shadows he could not outrun. He left no clear air, only a whisper, to the strongest, 3 words that cracked the world. His generals, those wolves of war, turned on each other beneath a burning sky. Seleucus, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Lysander, Lysimachus, once brothers in conquest, now warlords in a shattered dream. The empire did not die. It shattered like crystal, each piece still shining, each edge still sharp. They stole his body, wrapped in spices, shrouded in royal linens. His corpse was meant to return to Macedon, but Egypt wanted him. So did Syria, so did time. Ptolemy seized him mid-route and laid him to rest in Alexandria, a city born of Alexander's breath. But no grave was ever final. Some say his tomb was moved again. Others say it vanished, swallowed by sand and legend. To this day no one knows where he lies. perhaps because he never truly rested. The children of the generals inherited a world too large for any single dream. From the Nile to the Indus, Greek speech echoed in foreign lands, but it was no longer Macedon, no longer Hellas. It was something new, something hybrid, a world stitched from conquest and translation. Statues wore Greek robes, but their eyes were Eastern. Temples bore Olympian names, but worshipped unfamiliar gods beneath them. The Hellenistic world had begun. Alexandria, a city built like a prayer and a sword. Its lighthouse pierced the sea mist like a pillar of flame, guiding sailors into the mouth of empire. But deeper still was the library, where the knowledge of 1,000 worlds slept in ink and papyrus. They wrote of stars, of medicine, of lost continents and gods who walked in circles. It was a sanctuary of light, and like all light, it was destined to be envied and burned. In the hush of painted halls, men argued not with swords, but with syllogisms. Stoic, skeptics, Epicureans. They wandered through gardens, debating whether the soul was eternal, or if happiness could be weighed in olives and wine. The world outside still burned, but here, within the pages, beneath fig trees, it was possible to believe in peace. For a moment, and in Egypt, beneath the slow eye of the sun, Queen would rise, Cleopatra, not the first of her name, but the last of her line. She spoke Greek, ruled Egypt, and walked through Rome like it was a stage she owned. The cobra and the olive tree, beauty and politics woven like silk. She would become a myth. But before the myth, there was the girl, reading in the shadow of Alexander's tomb. The East had not forgotten. Bactria, Parthia, India. From the ruins of conquest, cities rose with names half Greek, half sacred. There were Buddhas with toga folds. There were kings who minted coins, with Zeus on one side, and elephant-headed gods on the other. The world was becoming one, not through unity, but through entanglement. Time moved on. Empires fell again. Rome would rise, then fall, and rise again. But beneath every stone arch, every mosaic, every forgotten city wall, there remained echoes of that boy who chased Homer into the sunrise. Alexander. He was not the first to conquer, not the last to die, but perhaps the only one whose shadow still dreams. And now you sleep. The age of heroes dims, and the stars return to their proper places. The maps are worn, the scrolls have crumbled, but in the hush between thoughts, in the deep rivers of sleep, the world still remembers, not just the names, but the feeling of wonder, of standing on the edge of the known, and stepping forward, into light, into legend, into the silence of history, that waits for your breath to fill Itai and the womb of Latium. Beneath 7 hills not yet named, 2 brothers cried beside a she-wolf's ribs. Romulus and Remus, born of Mars, son of a Vestal raped by war, left to die in a cradle of reeds. But the she-wolf came, fangs gentled by fate, milk flowing like river water. They suckled on legend, and in time would become one. Or rather, one would become. Romulus drew a line in the dirt. Remus stepped over it, and blood made a city. The city was not built in a day. It was dragged into existence by hunger. Huts became streets, mud became marble, and soon Rome was a body with a spine, the Forum its heart, the Senate its teeth. No kings, only men with iron wills and sharpened tongues. The Republic had no crown. Its power was not worn, but wielded. Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. Not gods, not emperors, but laws written in stone and shouted in the streets. It was messy, holy, beautiful, a city of contradictions, of gladiators and philosophers, of slaves and orators, of bread and circuses, and destiny carved from argument. There was once a man named Cincinnatus, a farmer with dirt in his hands and duty in his bones. When Rome was in danger, he was summoned. He put down his plow, became dictator, saved the state, and then he gave it back, returned to his field. In him lived the Republic's dream. That power was not a throne, but a burden. But dreams tire, and Rome began to gnaw at its own limbs. The Republic, so proud, so severe, bent under its own ambition. Conquered lands brought wealth, wealth brought corruption, and soon men who once served Rome began to serve only themselves. Into this swelling wound stepped a man. Storms. Julius Caesar, general, writer, seducer of queens. He crossed the Rubicon with a single legion and the whisper of empire in his eyes. The Republic trembled. Power was shifting, from marble halls to the grip of a single hand. The Ides of March. Beneath Pompey's statue, knives whispered across Caesar's body. He died clothed in blood and irony, killed not by barbarians, but by friends, by the very Senate he had once ruled with honey and steel. "Et tu, brute, even you," Rome cried out, not in justice, but in hunger for what came next. Mark Antony stood before the crowd, his voice a blade sharper than any steel. "Friends, Romans, countrymen." He did not defend Caesar's crown, only his wounds. And with each word, the people burned a little hotter. What had begun as mourning became revolution. Then came the queen again, Cleopatra, sailing up the Tiber in a ship scented with rose oil and ambition. She and Antony became legend, a story sung in silk, painted in betrayal, drowned in politics. Together they dreamed of empire. But Rome would not share power, and Octavian was watching. On the Ionian Sea, ships clashed like titans. Cleopatra's sails flared purple. Antony's legions roared. But Octavian, the quiet nephew, the shadow Caesar, had learned the art of patience. The lovers lost and fled. They found her in the palace, crowned with silence. Some say she let the ispi bite her breast. Others say poison in a jeweled comb. But none could deny, it was the end of the line. The last pharaoh, the last queen of the Nile. And then he emerged, Octavian, now Augustus, not king, not dictator, but first citizen. Titles did not matter, only power. The Republic was not killed, it was renamed. And so the empire began, with marble statues and censuses, with laws, roads, and mailed fists. Rome would stretch from the moors of Britannia to the sands of Arabia. All roads led to Rome, built by slaves, stamped with legionary sandals, carried wine, grain, soldiers, and news, and the sound of Latin, rolling like thunder through the valleys of Europe. Rome was now not just a city, it was a world. 200 years of peace, or so the story goes. Pax Romana, an age of poets and engineers, of aqueducts and colosseums, of laws etched in bronze. But peace is a relative term. Ask the Gauls, ask the Jews, ask those who wore chains beneath Rome's golden eagles. To keep the people quiet, Rome gave them bread and blood. The Circus Maximus roared. The Colosseum drank shadows. Gladiators fought for cheers and freedom. Someone, most died. And in the emperor's box, thumbs tilted fate. But beneath all the grandeur, something burned. The Senate weakened. The emperors grew stranger. Some worshipped themselves. Others danced with madness. And at the empire's edge, the barbarians listened, waited. Deep below, in catacombs lit by oil lamps, a new faith whispered. Christianity, born in occupied Judea, fed by martyrdom, grown in secrecy. It spread through soldiers, slaves, and widows, until even emperors could not ignore it. And then the unthinkable. The Emperor Constantine saw a vision before battle, a cross in the sky. In this sign, conquer. The empire bent its knee to Christ. Temples became churches. Altars became baptismal fonts. Rome was changing again. The old gods fell silent. The Vestal fires died. Rome, the eternal city, now walked through shadows of its former self. Barbarians at the gates, emperors in chaos, a dream unraveling. But even in decline, Rome was still Rome, still vast, still echoing. And so it ends, not with a scream, but with a slow, remembering breath. Rome fell, but not really. It lived on, in laws, in languages, in every broken ruin and story that followed. Rome never truly died. It became an idea, and ideas do not perish. They haunt, they inspire. They sleep like emperors beneath the dust. From the ashes of Caesar's fall rose Augustus, the shrewd architect of a new order. He wore no crown, but his power was absolute. The first citizen, guardian of peace, the princeps of a Rome reborn. Through cunning and patience, he stitched an empire from civil war, binding countless peoples beneath one sky, one law, one pax Romana. 2 centuries of peace. The empire's heart beating steady and strong. Roads like arteries, connecting Rome to the farthest provinces. Aqueducts spilling crystal waters into cities. Markets alive with silk, spices, and stories. But peace, like all things, carried its shadows, silenced voices, forgotten wars, and the price of empire. In the heart of the city rose the Colosseum, an arena of spectacle and blood. Gladiators battled for honor, for freedom, or simply survival. The crowd roared, thirsty for heroes and monsters alike. Here Rome displayed its might, not just through legions but through fire, sand, and sweat. But Rome was more than battles and blood. In the Forum, philosophers debated, orators swayed the crowd, and laws were forged from rhetoric and reason. Cicero's voice rose, calling for justice and honor, even as the Republic crumbled beneath his feet. The city was alive, vibrant, fracturing, and eternal. Beyond the city, the empire stretched vast and wild. From the frozen forests of Germania to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, Rome's legions marched, built, and ruled. But the edges frayed. Tribes resisted, rebellions flared, and whispers of empire's end grew louder. In the empire's shadowed corners, a new faith took root, a message of love, sacrifice, and redemption. It spoke to slaves and nobles, to soldiers and widows. Though persecuted, Christianity grew, a quiet revolution of the soul. And soon even emperors would kneel. Before battle, Constantine saw a sign, a cross of light. In this sign, conquer, he heard. He embraced the faith, altering the course of empire. Christianity was no longer whispered in catacombs. It became the empire's heart. Temples became churches, and Rome's soul transformed forever. Rome became 2 worlds, east and west, light and shadow. Constantinople rose on the Bosporus, a new Rome, a fortress of faith and power. But the western half faltered, cracked by invasion and decay. The empire's heartbeat slowed. Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, names whispered like thunder. They came from the wild lands beyond the walls, fierce and relentless. Rome, once invincible, now trembled behind its stone gates. In 476 CE, the last Western emperor fell, and with him an age ended. But Rome never truly died. Its ruins stand as echoes, whispers of power, faith, and human will. The city sleeps beneath layers of history, dreaming of legions, emperors, and the crowds that once roared. And as you close your eyes tonight, remember, Rome's story is still alive, in stone, in spirit, in every breath you take. In the east, where the waters of the Bosporus shimmer like liquid glass, a city rose to catch the falling torch. Constantinople, a citadel of marble and mosaics, crowned by domes, guarded by walls that watched the centuries pass. Here, the Roman flame flickered on, brightened by Greek thought, tempered by Christian fire, and steered by emperors who now bore crosses with their crowns. It was a world reborn in twilight, a dream wrapped in silk and sword. Beneath the vaulted heavens of Hagia Sophia, light poured like liquid gold. Columns soared, marble walls shimmered with holy visions, and choirs echoed through cavernous silence. It was not simply a church, but a cosmos made of stone and soul, a miracle born of mortar and mysticism. Here, men walked into the light and felt, for a heartbeat, what it was to touch the infinite. They called themselves Romans still, cloaked in silk, speaking Greek, writing laws in Latin, praying eastward toward Jerusalem. In court, eunuchs whispered politics, generals marched with jeweled swords, and emperors ruled like sacred flames, half divine, half man. This was Byzantium, a world of icons and intrigue, of saints and spies, where the past was never forgotten but gilded. But in the West, Rome had fallen into ruin. Stone by stone, its grandeur was quarried for churches, its streets overgrown, its forums quiet but for the wind. Kings now wore wolf pelts, scribes copied wisdom in candlelight, and the memory of empire lived on only in stories and in dreams. In lonely cloisters and frost-covered monasteries, a different kind of warrior worked, the scribe. By hand, he wrote the past into the future, copying Virgil and Genesis, Aristotle and Augustine. With ink and devotion, he kept the light alive. Each illuminated page a candle in the dark. In the vacuum of Rome's fall, new kings carved their realms with iron and blood. Franks, Goths, Lombards, tribes with fire in their veins and Roman dreams in their hearts. They wore the empire like borrowed robes, unfitting yet sacred. Their thrones were forged in war, but their crowns dreamed of Caesar. Then came a man of iron and vision, Charlemagne, crowned emperor in Rome on Christmas Day. He ruled a patchwork of tribes, but dreamed of unity, of learning, of law, of an empire reborn in the shape of the old. Under his watch, cathedrals rose, schools blossomed, and a glimmer of classical order returned. But from the sea the north awoke. Vikings, riders of storm and wave, hunters of gold and glory. They came with fire, burning monasteries, raiding coasts, their longships like dragons on the tide. Yet even these wolves of ice would one day kneel and become kings. Slowly a new world took shape. Not Roman, not tribal, but something in between. Patchwork of faith, fealty, and fire. Stone churches replaced pagan shrines. Kings kissed crosses and claimed divine right. Europe dreamed itself into Christendom. The sword was now the pen of God. And still, in the quiet hours of night, you can hear it, the echo of a world once whole. The drumbeat of legionaries, the debates of senators, the whisper of scribes, the hymns of monks, and the prayers of 1,000 empires rising, falling, rising again. Civilization does not sleep. It dreams, through ruin, through memory, through Judea and the vast silence of the Arabian sands, where stars outnumber grains, and the wind sculpts time into dunes. A voice rose. Not from throne nor army, but from a man alone in a cave. Muhammad, merchant, listener, a seeker of truth. In the stillness of Hira, he heard a command that would shake the earth. Recite. And so a world changed. What began with a whisper spread like fire on the wind. From Mecca to Medina, from sand to stone, the words of the Quran moved hearts and forged nations. Not with chaos, but with law, with learning, with the rhythm of prayer 5 times a day. A civilization emerged where desert once ruled. They came not just with swords, but with books. Scholars rode alongside soldiers. Physicians followed kings. Maps were drawn in ink, not blood. In Damascus, in Cairo, in Samarkand and Isfahan, cities bloomed like oases, centers of trade, translation, and the soul of inquiry. In Baghdad, where 2 rivers meet in murmuring embrace, rose the House of Wisdom, not just a library but a beacon. Greek thought translated to Arabic, Indian numbers turned into universal truths, stars mapped with precision, medicine practiced with care. A city of lamps in the dark ages of others. And yet, as Islam grew, so too did tensions. Jerusalem, a city sacred to Jew, Christian, and Muslim alike, became the mirror of the world's longing. Its stones were kissed by prophets, its hills climbed by dreams. And over it all, the ancient question returned: whose God would rule the earth? In the West, a pope lifted his voice. Not to preach peace but holy war. Deus vult, they cried. God wills it. And across the fields of France, from castles to cathedrals, men took up the sword to march eastward to reclaim a tomb. They did not know the cost. Through snow, through sun, through cities and silence they came. Crusaders. Some prayed, others pillaged, but all walked into history with the weight of righteousness and the stain of blood. Jerusalem fell, then rose, then fell again. The holy ground soaked not in miracles, but memory. Then came a warrior of light, Saladin, firm in faith, but generous in victory. When he retook Jerusalem, there were no massacres, no walls weeping blood. He offered safe passage. He prayed in peace. And in doing so, he taught the world that greatness lies not only in conquest, but in restraint. While the West and East clashed in steel, another world turned quietly in gold. In Africa, camels trod ancient salt roads, trading silence for riches. Timbuktu, empires of earth and spirit. And in the sands, the Quran echoed beside the drums. And still Byzantium stood, wounded but radiant. Its walls held back waves of invaders. Its churches rang with liturgies sung in candlelight. The double-headed eagle watched east and west, while emperors walked mosaic halls under eyes of saints. But the world was shifting, and even Constantinople could not halt time. The clash of belief, etched into stone and steel, played out not only in battle, but in memory. For every crusader who marched, there was a pilgrim who wept. For every Saladin, a Richard. For every siege, a prayer. And Jerusalem, that trembling jewel, stood ever between them, not conquered but carried by longing. Antioch fell, and rose again. So did Edessa. So did Acre. So did every city that lay between two worlds. But even walls get weary. In the cracks, new voices stirred. Merchants tired of war, mystics dreaming unity, children who had never known peace. When kings took the cross, they brought not only armies, but pride. Frederick, Richard, Philip, crowned heads bent before relics, but not before each other. The Crusades became theater, pageantry, diplomacy wrapped in blood. And so, the cause was no longer divine, but dynastic. And then came the saddest march. Not knights, not warriors, but children. Thousands set out, believing their innocence could melt walls, could soften hearts, could reclaim the holy city. Most never returned. The final crusades faded not with glory, but with exhaustion. Too many wars, too many coffins. Even the banners drooped. The East remained, unmoved by the West's fury. And the West turned inward, wounded and wondering. What had been won? Byzantium, jewel of the East, glowed still, but dimmer. Once Rome's second heart, it beat now under siege. The Ottomans watched and waited. And behind the golden mosaics, priests whispered desperate liturgies, as if words could hold back time. Far to the east, another power was stirring. The Silk Road pulsed with caravans and compass-bearers. From Xi'an to Damascus, from Samarkand to Venice, ideas flowed with spices, and the whisper of change drifted westward. And then, thunder from the grasslands. Genghis Khan, not a mere conqueror but a force of nature. From the heart of Mongolia, he sent forth horsemen faster than rumor, more disciplined than kings. Cities fell, empires shivered, and a new order galloped across the world. But even conquest birthed peace. The Mongols unified what had once been scattered. For a time, a fragile peace settled. Merchants moved without fear. Languages met, ideas interwove. It was brutal, but it was brief, and it changed the world. In the shadow of Mongols, crusades, and collapsing empires, Europe stirred. Not in castles, not in courts, but in monasteries. In candlelit rooms, monks copied ancient texts. Aristotle, Galen, Euclid. The flame of knowledge had not gone out. It flickered quietly. In 1453, the ancient city that bridged worlds fell beneath the thunder of cannon and prayer. Walls that had stood for 1,000 years crumbled like dust beneath Ottoman might. The last emperor's light flickered and faded, and with it an age whispered its final breath. Yet even in darkness, seeds of a new dawn stirred. From the ashes of empire, from the smoke of fallen cities, the world began to stir. The printing press sparked like wildfire. Words once chained to parchment now flew free. Ideas that slept for centuries awoke. The Renaissance was born, a rebirth of light, of art, of human longing. Florence, the heartbeat of this awakening, where poets whispered verses of beauty and loss, where painters captured the divine in flesh and stone, and thinkers dared to ask, what does it mean to be human? Here the world leaned forward, breathing in possibility. Beyond the horizons, beyond the edge of the known world, ships set sail. New lands called to adventurers, their flags planting dreams in waters uncharted. The map expanded, and with it the human story. But every journey bore the weight of old worlds, and new shadows followed the dawn. Beneath the grandeur of cathedrals and courts, beneath the ink of scholars and the brush of artists, the past lingered, a whisper, a shadow, a pulse. The stones of Rome, the prayers of Byzantium, the songs of the desert wind, all carried forward in memory and myth. History is not just what was, but what we carry with us. Civilizations rise, they fall, and rise again, each ending a beginning, each shadow pierced by light. In every stone, in every story, there is a heartbeat, steady, enduring, eternal. And as you drift to sleep tonight, know that you are part of this dance, a thread in the endless tapestry. What will they say of us, of this age, this moment? Will our stories be told with wonder, with sorrow, with hope? The future is unwritten, a canvas waiting for new light. And as the stars wheel overhead, rest now, for tomorrow the story continues. Good night, Rome. Good night, Byzantium. Good night, desert sands and winding roads. Good night to the dreamers, the warriors, the scholars, the saints. Sleep in the arms of time, cradled by memory and myth, till the dawn calls us once more. Listen closely. Can you hear them? The stones whisper. The winds tell tales. The past is alive, not only in books and bones, but in the silent breath between each heartbeat. History lives in you. Now close your eyes. Let the past cradle you. Let the stories of kings and peasants, of warriors and priests, of empires lost and found, carry you gently into dreams. For history is not just the story of what was, but the song of what will be. Good night, good dreams.